Today, we're diving into a story about a promise made over 200 years ago between nations, one that's still alive and kicking, all symbolized by a really strange delivery that happens every single year. Let's get into it.
This quote from Sidhill, a leader of the Onondaga Nation, just cuts right to the chase, doesn't it? He's basically saying it's not about the stuff, it's about the symbolism. The simple act of giving this cloth means a promise is still being honored, and that's everything.
So, this is the big question. It sounds kind of bizarre, right? Like some dusty old tradition that forgot to end. But believe me, this yearly shipment of cloth is the key to unpacking one of the oldest and most important agreements in American history. And the answer, well, it all goes back to something called the Canandaigua Treaty, signed way back in 1794. And this wasn't just some handshake deal. This was a formal pact between two sovereign powers that, incredibly, is still in force today. That cloth is a living thread connecting us all the way back to that moment.
Okay, so to really get why this treaty was such a big deal, you have to picture the United States in the 1790s. This brand new country, it was fragile, it was broke, and it was teetering on the edge of a war it absolutely could not afford to fight.
And believe me, things were incredibly tense. After the Revolution, the U.S. got aggressive, forcing treaties like the one at Fort Stanwix that took a lot of land and created a ton of resentment. By 1794, the small U.S. Army was already getting hammered in a war out in Ohio. The last thing George Washington needed was to open up a second front against the Haudenosaunee. That was a nightmare scenario.
And this is what's so wild to think about. We tend to see the early U.S. as this inevitable powerhouse, but back then, not so much. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy held all the cards. Get this, they could field more warriors than the entire United States Army. Let that sink in. Washington knew that making peace wasn't just a good idea, it was essential for the country's survival. And hey, just so we're all on the same page, the Haudenosaunee, sometimes known as the Iroquois, are this incredible centuries-old alliance of 6 nations. They operated as one political and military power, which is exactly why they were so formidable.
So this desperate need for peace led to the negotiating table. The treaty is often called the Pickering Treaty after America's lead negotiator. The goal for both sides was to, and I love this phrase, polish the chain of peace and friendship, to basically repair a relationship that was falling apart.
And you have to look at who was actually in the room for these talks. It's a fascinating group. For the U.S., you've got Timothy Pickering, Washington's right-hand man for this. For the Haudenosaunee, you have legendary leaders like the powerful orator Red Jacket. And, this is key, you had Quakers there as neutral observers because trust was in very short supply. And this is the actual document, signed on November 11, 1794. You can even see the wax seals with the symbols of the Haudenosaunee leaders. Later, George Washington himself ratified it, making it the supreme law of the land. This is a real piece of history.
So what was actually in it? Well, first, peace, a firm and permanent friendship. Second, and this is the big one, the U.S. formally recognized the sovereignty of the 6 nations and their right to their own lands. Huge. In exchange, the U.S. got safe passage for its citizens, which was vital for trade. And finally, number 4, the U.S. agreed to a yearly payment of goods forever. And that brings us right back to the cloth. But here's where the story gets really complicated. Because over the next 2 centuries, the legacy of this treaty would become a tale of 2 very different kinds of promises. One that was kept with meticulous care, and others that were just shattered. Because this treaty has this split personality, you could say. On the one side, the U.S. government has never once missed that annual payment. The delivery of the treaty cloth is an unbroken chain stretching back to 1794. But on the other side, the core promises, the ones about protecting Haudenosaunee land and sovereignty, have been broken over and over again. The treaty was super specific. It said the annual payment of goods should be worth $4,500. Now back then, that was a pretty serious amount of money. But here's the catch. The treaty locked in that number, $4,500, forever. Nobody thought to add a clause for inflation. So today, that same amount of money buys just a few rolls of cheap muslin cloth. It's a shadow of the original payment. And while the payment's value is shrinking, the violations of the treaty were growing. I mean, these are just a few of the most painful examples. land deals based on deception, and then in the 1960s, the U.S. government literally seized 10,000 acres of Seneca land explicitly protected by this treaty, to build the Canandaigua Dam. It was a direct, undeniable violation.
So you have to ask, right? If the payment is almost nothing and the big promises were broken, why on earth does this simple piece of cloth still matter so much? Well, because it's not about the cloth anymore. It's a symbol of something way more valuable than money. And this quote from Seneca historian G. Peter Jemison explains it perfectly. It's about sovereignty, the right to exist as a nation, the right to make your own decisions for your own people. That's what's at stake here. What it comes down to is this: that cloth is proof. It is a tangible, physical acknowledgement delivered every single year by the U.S. government that this is a nation-to-nation agreement. It confirms that the Haudenosaunee are not just a minority group. They are a sovereign partner in a treaty that is still the law of the land. And the story doesn't end there. In a twist that is just incredibly powerful, the cloth has found a new sacred purpose. Today, it's used to wrap the remains of ancestors who are finally being returned home for reburial. The very symbol of an enduring promise is now used to bring peace to those who came before. It's a profound act of historical poetry. So that's what we're left with. In a world full of broken agreements, this one treaty, this one promise, somehow endures, symbolized by a few yards of cheap cloth. It makes you really think, what does a promise between nations truly mean? And how do we honor the spirit of these agreements that were meant to last forever?